Hello and welcome to the Comfort Tax Purposes. You are riding with Mac today, and I am in Battlefield Portal playing something close to the Call of Duty game mode, Cranked. Now, it occurs to me there'll be two types of people who come to this video, those looking to learn how you make something like this, and those who just want to play this game mode. And for you guys, here is the experience code right now. You can bang that straight into Portal and spin up your own server of this game mode. Obviously, the features include a 30-second timer after your first kill, in which within that time you need to make another kill or you will be terminated by the game. In place of the perks that you would receive in Call of Duty, I unfortunately have had to settle for a health regen buff. I think it plays quite well and seems relatively balanced, and in truth, even against bots, I find it really quite fun. If you're one of these people, I hope this is exactly what you were looking for. I'd appreciate a like, and thanks for coming by today. For everyone else, I've got to assume that you want to know a little bit more about what's under the hood here. How exactly this was made, how you could make it, or perhaps you have an idea of a game mode in your head that you would like to recreate. But before you can accomplish that, there is the complicated and undocumented rules editor standing in the way, which hopefully I'm about to demystify a little bit for you. So without any more preamble, let's head over to the editor. Okay, so now we're in the rules editor of my Cranked game mode. Now, this looks a little bit complicated, but I'm going to break it down into little parts, which really is what you should do with most programming languages. I'm also not going to insult your intelligence and assume that you can set up a team deathmatch game. If not, there are loads of other tutorials that claim to be tutorials on Portal, but when they get to the rules section, they just go, and that's a place where you can change things, and that's pretty much the end of the video. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with something really simple, which is this rule down here. Now, this is just a sort of catch-all that I put in, but it's a good place to start. So a rule on its own is something that happens when an event is triggered. So in this case, it's an event that happens on a player dying. So every time a player dies, this rule will begin. And the logic of it is it checks a condition, which in this case there isn't one, but as I say, it'll check a condition, and if that is a condition that returns true, it'll run the action. Now, actions are these sort of yellow blocks, and within those actions there are these sort of, I'm not even sure what you would call them, these sort of bubble items. They just tend to be things. I know that's not a great description. If there was a documentation on this and they were defined in some way, I would call it that. But for now, we'll say they are things. In this case, this thing is a variable, and it happens to be calling the player variable that is known as Cranked for event player. Now, this is one of the most important things to get your head around. Event player is the player playing. So if that's me playing against bots, that's me. The person on the other team, for them, they are the event player. So in this case, what's going to happen when the player dies, we run this action, which is stop tracking a variable. We don't need to understand what tracking a variable is right now, but just to understand that is what we'll run. And then we are defining the variable. And on top of that, who that variable is for, in this case, the event player, or the player. Okay, so now we've got that sort of very base idea out the way. Let's look at this in a much larger view. Now, I can't stress this enough. This mod bracket is your mod. Anything that's not connected to that, with some rare exceptions, is not part of your mod. This took me a while to work out what was going on. I had a lot of code going on. None of it was executing. I couldn't understand why. If it's not part of this larger mod bracket, it's not going to run at all. Okay, so let's look at the main meat of this game mode. It is whether the player is cranked or not. So obviously, a player becomes cranked when they kill someone. So this rule is an event that happens on the player earning a kill. So the first thing that I've done here is to stop tracking a variable. This is the same as the one we saw down here. Now, basically, that's a catch-all. The bane of my existence for this has been the variable continuing to be tracked. If this was better documented, I'd probably know how to make sure that doesn't happen. But instead, I've just sort of included it anywhere I think it could crop up as a problem, just to stop that being a problem. So we're largely going to ignore these. They're there, they're important, but they don't actually change anything for us. So the first thing that's actually important is this set variable. Now the variable we've set here is crank. Now that obviously doesn't come in the game. You define a variable down here in the variables tab. You can then manage variables, and you can add one here we'll call test bar. Now, there's nothing particularly important about this variable. It is empty, there's nothing in it, until we define something within it that it can store. And that's what's important about this set variable. So we could play around with the test variable. This, however, happens to be a global variable, one that is wider to the game, whereas the cranked variable here is player dependent. It is different for each player, or can be different for each player. So for now, we'll stick with the set variable, and here we're defining the variable cranked for, in particular, the event player, the player himself. And what we're doing here is we're setting that variable to 30. Now, for those of you on the ball, you'll realise here I've set my starting of the timer 30 seconds. The next thing we want to do is we want that timer to start counting down. So we then have a track variable over time. Again, and you'll see a lot of repetition here, we're defining that variable for the event player, and then what on earth does 0 and 30 mean? Perhaps it means the same thing as it does here. Well, not exactly. The only documentation are these little help tags, and they are very important, although some of them aren't worded well. So what it's saying here for the first box is the variable, which we've defined. The second one is a number that is the limit, i.e. how low it can go, and I want it to go all the way down to 0. And the last number is an interval. Now that's not how often it happens, it's how long it takes for the variable to reach 0. So we've set a variable for 30. We've said we want it to go as low as 0, and we want that to happen in the space of 30 seconds. I also then take the opportunity to set the man down to skip. So this one's called skip man down. Relatively self-explanatory. Who for? The event player. Now why is there a true there? Let's go have a look. It's a bool. So we're saying, is that true or not? It is true that I want that event player to skip man down. If you wanted to unskip man down, you would make that a false bool. Now, all of these can be found here, usually using the search bar. Some of them don't show up. Don't ask me why. For example, if I do search for variable, one would expect that set variable would appear there, but it doesn't. It's hidden down here within variables. Don't know why. Something to be aware of. As a side note to get you going, those booleans, those true and falses are listed here. The numbers are listed here, and text, which we'll get to a little bit down here, but that's jumping ahead, are here with under literal. But usually take a bit of time, you'll find what you're looking for. There's an awful lot here. Not as much as I thought there was going to be, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but there is a lot here. Okay, so back on target, the next thing we want to do within the game mode is we need to tell the player how long they've got left. We've set them to 30 seconds on the timer, we've stopped that timer running, and we've also stopped them being able to be downed. This is a little bit complicated, but to be honest, when you break it down, it gets a lot simpler. So we're here checking this while loop, and it's a loop that basically anything within this purple section here will run this, run the next, run the next, run the next, until it gets to the bottom, and then start again. And it'll keep doing that as long as whatever you define here is true. The moment that becomes false, it'll bump out of this and carry on the logic. So in this case, what have we asked? Well, we've said, oh, well, we want to check something is greater than. Well, what are we checking is greater than? We're going to check a variable. And guess which variable we're checking? It's the cranked variable for the player. What are we checking that's greater than? Well, we're checking that number is greater than 0. Or to put it in a more human way, if the cranked variable of the player is greater than 0, carry on doing this, which is great. That's the time when we want a message to be displayed with the timer. Here is how we have the game display a timer. Again, another big set of these definitions or bubbles, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty, not so hard to understand. I'll start at the back here. We're saying where we want the message to display. The one that you saw earlier up in the top right happens to be called header text. The next one is in seconds how long it'll display. In this case, I don't need it to be there for more than 1 second because, as you'll see in a second, I'm replacing that message much quicker. Who is it displaying for? Well, we're displaying it for the event player again. So now we come to what the actual message entails. Now, obviously, I guess one way you could do this is to have 30 messages, all of which say which second it is. But that's not coding. That's not efficient, and it'd be a pain in the ass. Instead, we have these squirrely brackets, as I would call it. I believe Americans, you just refer to them as brackets. So this first part is just a message, and this is what we saw in the literals here. But these two squirrely bracket areas say, I want you here to display this, and in this one, I want you to display what's here. So the first one's pretty simple. It's event player. It's my name. That's why you can see McLeod at the start of the message. The second one here, not quite so simple. It's the actual seconds. So we're going to get the variable, which variable, cranked one, and display it. But there's a problem there. So this is being tracked all the time. The problem is the amount of decimals that the game has is something like 4. So at a moment when this grabs how much is left, it could say, McLeod, you have 21.7654 seconds remaining, which is just clutter. It's not needed at all. So we want to get that to something much more manageable. Let's say just seconds. And that's why we're using the round 2 definition here. So all that's saying is round whatever you get out of this. So when it says 22.7 seconds, it's going to round it to 23 seconds, something much more useful for a human. Great, we've got our message. But that's only going to happen once. So what do? Well, we want to wait a little while. Again, this is all in seconds. So we're going to wait 0.2 seconds. And then I'm going to pretend this isn't here and say, because this is a while loop, it will go back to the top. It'll look up what the variable is, round it to a number of seconds, and display it again every 0.2 seconds. So that's how you get that continuous timer going all the way down to 0. Now, the skip if that I literally just ignored is important because not everything goes right. In fact, what could happen is while a player is cranked, instead of dying because they didn't kill someone quick enough, they died because someone shot them. Well, this is where this logic comes in, and it checks if the player is alive. You see there, get player state, the player themselves, and a player state bool of is alive. And if that ever returns that they are dead, or indeed false compared to alive, it will no longer skip these last 2 instructions. So while the player is alive, it skips 2, which of course brings us back to the beginning. So once the player is dead, I'm again stopping the tracking of the variable. So the timer stops. There's no point counting how many seconds are left for a dead player. We do something called break, which is to leave this while. Even though this hasn't become 0, we are going to escape it by using break. One of 2 ways we can escape this while, either through the break as we just discussed, or the fact that the get variable becomes 0. Okay, so the player has run out of time. They haven't killed anyone. We'd better display a message telling the bad news. So in the same place, we are going to display a message, this time much more simple, just says time's up. Again, look, it's exactly the same logic blocks, just applied for a different reason. Same place, header text. This time we're going to have it there for 3 seconds for the event player, obviously, and just the words time's up. Now, for some complicated reasons, this code works a lot better if we set the variable again to 30. Variables don't like hanging around at 0. I'm not quite sure why. It seems to suggest if a variable is 0, it also counts as not existing. It gets rid of a lot of errors, best to do. We're going to stop tracking that variable just in case it hasn't happened before. And then obviously we're going to kill the player. It's important to note for perhaps a different game mode you're planning, this doesn't send you to the down state. It actually kills the player outright, whether this is selected or not. And so that's the meat of this game mode. Now, you'll notice there was a few other things going on there in the mod. We'll put that back in the mod to continue. Well, we have this one here. In the original Call of Duty game mode of Cranked, you would gain sleight of hand, a speed buff, and I think a few other perks. Well, perks obviously don't exist in Battlefield. And as I said, I settled on a health buff happening. Now we're going to ignore these first 2 here and just look at this while loop. This would all totally work just with this while loop. All right? And it's going to evaluate something just like we did back here. But this time we're evaluating the player's health. So we're going to get player state of the event player, player state number, their current health. And what we're checking is if it's less than 100, i.e. is their health less than full? If it is less than full health, we want to take the action of apply medical gadget or apply med gadget. 2, the event player, using what? A medgadget type of medical crate. That's what gives that sort of green flash and the sound of syringe. We're going to then wait the 0.2 seconds. This seems to work relatively well without bogging down the server. You might find that a different interval works best. And again, similarly to the other while, we're going to have this escape here just in case the player dies while the health's being applied. So we're going to get the player state of the player. Are they alive? If they are alive, skip one. If they aren't, break. In other words, because there's nothing left here, we're going to abort this rule. It's the end. So let's bring back those other 2 parts that I brought in here first. Now, this isn't needed at all. It's actually the closest I could get to having an effect. Okay? A large amount of the time, what you'll find is that the player kills someone else without taking any damage at all. It loses a little bit of the moment by not having that green hue come from the medical kit, which I wanted. So, again, another skip if. This time we are looking at the player. It's similar to this one. In fact, it's exactly the same. So it's going to skip if the player's current health is less than 100. How many are we going to skip? Just one. So we're going to skip this thing and head straight into the while loop. However, if this evaluates that in fact the player does have 100 health, we aren't going to skip and we're going to deal 1 damage to the player. From a gameplay perspective, this does nothing. You're not going to notice that 1 health because within a split second it gets applied again by the med gadget. But you do get that green hue, which I think adds something for gameplay reasons. It confirms to the player that they have entered a crank state or have renewed their crank state. So you can see how these rules start to build something much bigger than themselves. Again, I'm going to bring that catch-all back in. And I have to say, this isn't great code. It throws errors all over the place, mainly to do with the stop tracking of a variable. But I find them a necessary evil. I wouldn't want someone to be undeployed, but their variable still being tracked. You could end up in the awkward situation of them spawning, their variable perhaps being at 10, and within 10 seconds, they all of a sudden become terminated again. Depending on where that code is, they might not even have a message telling them it's going to happen. Now, if there's better documentation, there might be a way that I could ask the code, is a variable being tracked? If it is being tracked, stop tracking it. If it isn't being tracked, don't bother running this command. But that's for future me to think about, not something I can change here. Now, I did say to you that everything that is within these brackets will run and anything that's out of it won't run. The one caveat to that is something called subroutines. That's over here under this orange heading. I'm going to quickly create a new subroutine. I'm going to call it test sub and create. And we have this sort of rule box. Now, I'm sure people will be able to think of some very good reasons to use this. I suppose the only reason you would use it is if the event you wanted to trigger a rule wasn't listed as one of these things, which actually, now I think about it, probably happens quite a lot. So to trigger this subroutine, you'll see here that there was also this yellow box, and this fits in just like any other command. So if I added it here, after all this has run and kills the player, it would then run test sub, which would evaluate this subroutine. And again, look, it doesn't form part of this mod, but because that test sub's there, it does form part of the mod. As far as I can tell, this evaluates in exactly the same way as a rule. The only difference being, as I say, it's not triggered on the event of one of these things, it's triggered within a rule itself. And hopefully that's more than enough to get you started. There are a couple of bugs that I've started to refine. One of them, for certain that I know, is if the code breaks from this while, simply because the player died instead of dying to running out of time, it'll still display the custom message of time's up. If there's popularity of this sort of thing, I will do another video on it. In particular, the original cranked game mode awarded 2 points for every kill which you got while cranked, and I think that'd be a really quite cool thing to add here. Anyway, thank you all for joining me today. I wish there was more I could tell you about this. I wish DICE had added more. I would love to be able to change the speed a player could run, which would be much closer to the original cranked game mode, but as far as I can see, there's nothing to actually change that. In fact, there seems to be lots of things that you can change back in the modifiers that simply aren't changeable here in the rules editor, which seems a real oversight actually, why you couldn't just have a tab here of gameplay modifiers. But anyway, this is what we've got so far to work with. It's not bad. Hopefully it's a bit more intuitive now that someone's shown you what all of these things are. My advice to you would be take your time. Don't be afraid at any moment to right-click on anything and bring up the Help tabs. But most of all, have fun with it. And so all that's really left for me to say is thank you very much for watching, and I have been Mac, this has been Battlefield 2042, and you have been watching The Cult for Tax Purposes.